I just wanted to give a little kind of intro and first off, a big thank you to David, Michael, and Stan for participating today. We're really excited that they're here to talk with us about their experiences within the bioscience industry. I'm really excited to hear about their perspectives and their own career paths for this. Just as a preface for the panelists, this is a program that Cheatham and I proposed and got a little grant to run to help PhD students and postdocs kind of figure out what do they want to do for their careers. And so thus far in the program, we spent time kind of exploring their career skills and interests, reflecting on personalities and fits that are, things that are going to be important for them to be their best professional selves. And so the next step in this process is to start hearing about what are some of those experiences that people have within the bioscience industry. And the next step after this is that using all of this information, things they hear from the panelists today, their own self-reflection, they're going to identify some people working in different positions to do some informational interviews. Ultimately, at the end of this process, hopefully getting to a place where they feel like they have a nice understanding of what would be a good fit for them career-wise. I wanted to make one little note here, because I think this is important for a lot of training in academia, because I don't think we do enough really highlighting the diversity of careers that PhD trained scientists have and the kind of things they go into. And the story I'm going to say to that is for any of you who know Kristen Ardinger, that's Michael's wife. So Kristen is the program director for the bioscience umbrella program. She's a professor in craniofacial biology. I've worked with Kristen for years on stuff. And it was only recently that I found out that Michael works in the industry that he does and does the kind of work that he does that you'll hear about today. And so the reason I share that story is that I think for a lot of folks who are going through training, we keep thinking that, well, you become a professor. That's what you do when you have a PhD. But there are all these people that do those other things. We just don't get to hear those stories. And so for you, when you think about your advisors right now or other faculty, I promise you, they know people that are doing other things that they went through training with, that they did their postdoc with, that they're their spouses. And so again, continuing to have some of those conversations, I think is important just to raise that awareness of all the things that you can do. Okay, so with that, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Cheatham and I came up with a list of some questions to get things going, but really we want you to have kind of the time to ask your questions as well. Before we do that, Cheatham, I want to give you some space if there's anything that you wanted to say to add on to anything.
I want to actually remind the trainees here that you have a really distinguished panel here. It can't go anything better than this. You have a very accomplished entrepreneur, director of a VC firm, very successful angel investor, and who also work in big industry. So this is a great opportunity for you to really learn about different perspectives. So benefit to the most you can.
Yes, thank you for adding that. I appreciate that, and I wholeheartedly agree. Okay, so Cheatham, do you want to, should we go back and forth with some of the questions that we have, or do you want me to just, I can start with the first question we had. Was we just really wanted to ask the panelists just to give a brief intro to kind of their own career paths, kind of how they, made decisions that they did along the way, just to let people know a little bit about kind of what your experiences have been to lead you where you are today. And I think we're just going to let whomever would like to start jump in there. So I'll leave it to Stan, David, and Michael to see who's most eager.
I can go ahead. You can go alphabetically if you want. And I'm still blown away that my wife publicly acknowledged that she's married to me, So yeah, I'll try and keep it brief. So my wife and I went to graduate school together, both got our PhDs in development of biology, and went to Boston for postdocs. And I knew going into the postdoc that I did not want to stay in academia. Just the way my brain works, I was, to be honest, kind of afraid of becoming very specialized, studying one question maybe a big question, but one question in science for the rest of my career. And I have more of a business mind. I like understanding finances. How do you take a complex technology and make it something that is potentially a product ultimately? And so I did a very short industry postdoc. So I was in Boston in the mid 90s. The Human Genome Project was happening. Worked for a company that was focusing on the Human Genome Project. After the postdoc, got promoted to senior scientist, and then was running a human genomics program there. But then you're faced with the question, do I want to stay in science and industry, or do I want to go to the business side of science? And that's when I made the jump. So fast forward 24 years since I got my PhD, I've worn many different hats. So I've worked for life science companies, even things that are distantly related to life sciences, software companies, but we're active in the life science space. Drug development companies, vaccine, life science tools, reagents, analytical instruments. I'm kind of a utility player. I like understanding a lot of things, but very shallowly, if that's the right word, and not getting too deep, but also being able to determine if it's good science very quickly, and then decide, okay, what resource do we need to put in place to move that technology forward. I joined the research group I'm with now about 3 years ago, the investor group I'm with about 3 years ago. It's called Vic Technology Venture Development Group. We do not invest in pre-existing companies. It's somewhat unique. We look for technologies at universities, institutes, national labs, both here in the US and internationally, primarily life science, but also material sciences, physical sciences, engineering types of technologies. And after going through a pretty extensive due diligence process, if we like the technology, we create a brand new company, make a seed investment into that company. One of the managing directors, of which I'm one, will serve as the interim CEO for that company for the first 2 years until it's ready for a full-time CEO. So I like what I do now because I get to look at cool technologies, make sense of them, filter through hundreds to get to one that becomes a new company and an investment. But then I get to put on my operations hat and work with the company, go through the 12 to 24 month plan to make sure we're getting the funding in, continuing to have the wherewithal to move that technology towards commercialization. We may never get it to commercialization, but we want it to get to a point where it's an exit opportunity. We get a nice return on our investment. That's the ultimate goal of any investor group. So I'll turn it over to the next person.
All right, so if we're going to go alphabetical order, I assume it's by last name now since Michael started, and
sorry,
I'll be the least accomplished middle of the Oreo cookie between Michael and Stan. So a private disclaimer, since we're talking about trainees, I am not a PhD. And we could talk about why I'm not a PhD. So that's a different story. But I really know two things. Well, I guess now I know a couple of things. But normally how I phrase my career path, I know two things. I know basic science research when I was supposed to be a PhD at Hopkins, that little dinky school in Baltimore. And then not unlike Michael. So I think there's going to be some interesting parallels here. Not unlike Michael, I was like, wow, I don't know that I want to be an academician. And candidly, Hopkins was training you exactly for that, right? So that's what it was. Core capability is we make more professors or we make more doctors. That's what we do. That's our brand. If I were to now put my business hat on. So there were not a lot of role models of, hey, this is what you can go do outside of raising the next cohort of scientists. Right. So just like we talked about in diversity and inclusion, without role models, it's hard to visualize for yourself. Right. Whether that's gender or even career path, how do you do this? So also like Michael, I went to grad school with my wife. So there's two parallels right away. And she's the more accomplished of the two of us. So maybe I should have her here instead of me. So the Hopkins trained physician, sorry, my dogs are voicing their opinion. So the Hopkins trained physician decided to come out to Colorado and do her residency out here. So that's how I got from the East Coast, which I will tell you, there was no earth between the East Coast and the West Coast. So I had to discover that there was a middle of this country. So I came out here and I actually had to say, what do you do with a biomedical engineering degree? I'm not a real engineer by any of those that would be an engineer like Stan, right? So biomedical engineers weren't real engineers, so I couldn't go solve real engineering problems. But I had this fluency in physiology and in medicine that regular engineers didn't, right? So from a business perspective, I could speak the language of my customers. I could go in and talk to clinicians and doctors and not get lost in the centimeters or the idiopathology or the multisyllabic words they would throw around, right? So long story short, I spent about a third of my career on the engineering operations side and 2/3 of my med device career on the commercial side of some way, shape, or form, global or US, traditional marketing, new product development marketing, mergers and acquisitions. So that would be my MBA by career path perspective of my life. So I did that, and then I had the opportunity to leave big corporate America. And candidly, I've worked for only two companies, two branded companies, and one was Code Cardiovascular, which was a company out in Colorado, a stalwart of the original med device out here, and that got acquired. And I worked for what was Value Lab, Tyco Healthcare, Covidien, and Medtronic. That was really my other career path. But in that, I think I had maybe at one point I was averaging a different job every 18 months. So a lot of varied approach, a lot of ticket punching. All that to say, I have a pretty big view of med device from the operations and the sales side, but I also have it from a continuum of care. So I've done long-term acute care, I've done EMS, and what my favorite is kind of the high acuity hospital stuff. And so then as actually Shigden knows me, I'm really more now an angel investor guy as well as a startup guy. So Stan actually was one of the first introductions I made when I left that world and came into the startup side to actually start helping folks at Anschutz and in this program. So that's really the last 2 years of my life has been as a entrepreneur angel investor with the Rockies Venture Club, gratuitous plug for them, the oldest angel investing organization in the US. I've been doing a ton of mentoring, and then I found myself now trying to walk the talk as a chief operating officer of a startup. So much to Michael's perspective, all the ticket punches along the way kind of allow you to not only put together a plan, but to rapidly put on the operational hat when the plan goes awry. And that's really every day of the startup life is when something doesn't work the way you intended it. And unlike Medtronic or Covidien or even Cobe, there's not a lot of resources other than you. So your ability to take off your gloves, roll up your sweater and say, okay, how are we going to put together our DHF? Because boy, we don't have one. All that comes to fruition. So that's kind of my career path in a nutshell and why I'm talking to you guys and gals today.
Great. I'm Stan Lapidus. I'm an engineer, electrical engineer, and an inventor and entrepreneur. For my degrees in electrical engineering, I went to work. I had a job. I worked for a company that designed gamma cameras. I was the principal engineer, and I made my first invention. It was something that at the time was important, which was a way to correct non-uniformity in gamma cameras. Sales doubled the next year. We went from being at the bottom 11th out of 11th in market share, and we rose pretty rapidly. I got $100 for my invention. And I thought I could do better on my own. I quit. I started an engineering consulting company that became an industrial machine vision company. It did okay. It was sold for $20 million. Investors had put, I forget now, 6 or 8 million in. So everybody made money. Two of my investors approached me and asked if I'd be interested in doing it again. So at that point, I was very deep into image processing science, and I was looking for a large problem in industrial machine vision. And after just a few weeks of hunting, I landed on the pap smear as an important unsolved problem. I started a company called Cytic. We worked for about a year or two on trying to have computers with late 1980s Macintosh technology read pap smear slides, look for the big dark nuclei that are hallmarks of abnormal pap smears and are the signs of early cervical cancer. So we couldn't do that because the cells would overlap each other and the mucus and the blood made it too hard to see. So I came up really out of desperation with a way to make a better pap smear. And though it took quite a while, the highlights of the story were, I think we filed the initial patents in 1989 or 1990. We had our first publication in, I'm going to say 92, that showed that our pap smear was better than the traditional pap smear. A lengthy FDA process followed by an IPO. In 2002, the company was declared a monopoly by the Federal Trade Commission because all the pap smears switched to us because we were better. The company was sold for $6 billion in 2007, and in 2011 or 12, our prototypes found their way to the Smithsonian, where you can see them. The idea, it was a success, of course, and the essence of the success was recognizing that the problem that the market wanted wasn't an image processor to read pap smears, it was better medical answers. And that was driven by kind of gynecologists. Along the way, I learned how to raise money. I learned a lot about medicine. I'm not a physician, but I became a professor of pathology at Tufts and then later an adjunct at MIT. And I kept being interested now. So now I was intrigued by early detection of cancer. And I collaborated with a Johns Hopkins colleague of David's, Bert Vogelstein, and we developed something called the Cologuard test for early detection of colorectal cancer. So I'm not the sole inventor as I was with the ThinPrep, but one of the inventors. There's many people over the years who've been involved. And the idea was to detect altered DNA shed from the colon in stool, recover the DNA, look for the methylation changes, the mutations that are associated with pre-malignant lesions, with precancers. So it was a very long journey. In 2014, the company got FDA approval for today's Cologuard test. It's roughly equivalent to colonoscopy, but of course, doesn't involve the invasiveness and the bowel prep and the risk that a colonoscopy involves. That company, under its outstanding current leader, Kevin Conroy, has a valuation of, on any given day, between $20 and $25 billion. So it was a great success. And the commercial success is all due to Kevin. The lessons that I learned along the way were that invention, science, business, engineering, all of that lies on one intellectual continuum. The problems are the same. The domain expertise is a little different, but the way one thinks, the role of creativity, the role of fresh thinking is the same. I've started 2 companies also that were not successful. So I had 2 great successes in healthcare and 2 failures. And the lessons learned there are perhaps more important than the lessons of the success. One of them I'll share with you now, and maybe we'll talk more about them later. And it has to do with, at least for me, if I'm the inventor, I know what the shortcomings are, and I know how to, either get it to work or not, but I know what the shortcomings are. And the other 2 companies, we in-licensed scientific discoveries from others at prominent institutions, prominent scientists, but there was less there than met the eye. And if I knew that at the time, I would have done something else. So I guess I would say I like to think of myself as an engineer who's learned how to do a little bit of science, but I've not learned how to be a hardcore evaluator of the science of others, especially if it's developed in an academic setting.
Thank you all for that. That was, I think you all just put a big exclamation point on Cheatham's introduction there too, about all that you're offering today for folks to listen to. So I think, again, before we get into some of the additional questions Cheatham have, I want to make sure we have time for some of the questions from trainees. And so I'm thinking that with that, maybe we'll address a couple of these. So one question came in about recommending pursuing industry postdoc after a PhD, and what are some of the major pros cons compared to going straight into an industry position. And so I think that was directed more towards Michael, but everyone has perspective to comment on that too.
Yeah, I can take the first stab at it. I mean, if you can go directly into industry and not have to do a postdoc, then that would be ideal. But the problem or the challenge is that if you're trying to get a research position at a biotech company, especially a larger biotech company, a Genentech, an Amgen, Gilead, companies like that, straight out of your PhD or even straight out of a postdoc, typically they want to bring you in for a year or 2 years as an industrial postdoc, see how you work, see how you do in the private sector. You're not in an academic setting anymore, which is very different. We can talk more about that as well. But if you're looking at smaller companies, what we call SMEs, small to mid-sized enterprises, biotech companies, medical device companies, diagnostics companies that are, I don't know, arbitrarily less than 1,000 employees, less than 500 employees, you might be able to go directly to a research position that's not a postdoc in that company. I don't know if there are any follow-on questions with regards to that. One theme I would like to elaborate on is that there is a huge difference doing research in a company versus doing research at a university. when you're in a company, the company tells you what to do. And if your project is no longer, viable, they've decided to pivot, make a strategic change, the next day you come in, you're working on something completely different. So you can't get emotionally attached. And we do, in graduate school and as postdocs, get emotionally attached to our research. We're proud of it. We're kind of living and breathing it, but that goes away. It's all business considerations for what research you're doing, how much money they put into it, how long they continue to sponsor it. So that's something that you should also keep in mind if you're thinking about moving over to the private sector. Anybody else want to take a stab at that one?
Not having been a PhD, so now I've got to say that twice, right? So I'm the dumb one on the panel, but having worked with, and had PhDs and employees, I think it really depends on what you want to be when you grow up. And I don't mean that as a shot, because I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up, right? Because hopefully that journey's not done until someone's putting you in the grave, right? And so to that end, if what you get is, if the joy, the pleasure you get is the translation of your idea into someone else's mind, then go into industry. If the joy you get is the translation of that idea into a paper and a publication, then I would say go that academic path. Because the value in industry, and I've sat on a couple of boards where I still think there's more work that needs to be done in academia, and I park that, is taking your idea and getting that idea to seed and germinate in other people's heads to go out and change the business, right? And to make that impact. So if you can communicate and communicate simply, then I think going into industry, and I agree with Michael, while I've been in big, we never on the device side, and I should say that disclaimer, we never really had like postdocs. It was, if you were a PhD, you were coming in to solve a problem, right? We didn't have the ability to say, hey, we're gonna assume you can hit the ground running and have you make a difference. And I think that's a little bit more the med device world than the biosciences or the biotechs. So I would just put that as kind of helping you to sort the chaff from the wheat in your own career.
Okay. So were you going to add something else, Michael, or was that?
Yeah, I was just so another extension of this topic is you don't necessarily have to limit yourself to going into the research side of industry, right? If you're thinking about a career transition, you could go get your MBA. You could go get your law degree. You could go into patent law. You can go to the business side of the biotech or life science industry, broadly defined. But that's a commitment, right? So, if you think that you're more business minded after getting your PhD, after doing your postdoc, finances, business development, strategic partnering, negotiations, things like that intrigue you, you're more of an outgoing extrovert type of person, then maybe that's the right path to go. If you've been exposed to the IP space, you've filed an invention disclosure with your university, see innovations in this case, you've helped them write the patent, that piques your interest, then maybe that's the right path to go. But there are a lot of different options for people who have a PhD, on what they want to do. They can go the entrepreneurial route. They can start a company based on their research if it's commercially viable and go through that process, which is a whole different can of worms.
I have a thought that you might wish to consider. So I've hired many PhDs, never in a postdoc, right into the company, and at competitive salaries, much higher than what postdocs are paid. In academia, you often work on your problem alone. You might have your own small team of trainees, but you're working alone. And the people who have a common research interest to you are people who compete for the same grant dollars as you do. So your competitors are your intellectual allies, and other people in your department could care less what you do. They've got their research and you have yours. In industry, especially in startups where you rise and fall together. So the sense of comradeship is very deep. And as Michael pointed out, it's business. So if something fails, or if we pivot because something isn't working, you're either laid off or part of the new team. And these are emotionally wrenching events. But then the highs of the great successes well, they may be worth it. If they're worth it to you, this is a reason to consider a career in industry. Last bit on this is as I would drive to work, very often I would see a tractor trailer pull out with a Cytec logo on it. And that would be full of 1 million of these disposable devices at $10 each. And it would pull out once or twice a week out of this plastics manufacturer. And the notion that each year, 50 to 75 million American women got more accurate pap smears, got cancer prevented, a hysterectomy avoided, a life saved, was reinforced by seeing that truck pull out of the parking lot. That's something really quite special.
So thank you for that last comment too. I really appreciate one of the things that we have talked about is trying to think about getting people making career transitions to identify what does the world need you to be. And so that piece of, making that difference and having that connection, I think is really important in this process. I want to ask one of these questions to everyone, because I think it dovetails a little bit with this. So it seems like that each of you have held many different positions and moved through different companies. And is that normal? And does it feel like there's a lack of stability? And if so, is that stressful in any way?
Well, it's certainly stressful, and it's emotionally, emotional highs and lows. But I've come to view it as, like now I'm granddad. So as you bring your children up, your children go off and they do their thing and you're proud of them. And then, it pays back in other ways. It pays back with grandchildren. I never had planned, my whole personal business model was I'm an inventor. So I invent things, I prove that they work, I raise the money, I build a team, I take it to the commercialization plus minus and then hire my successor. So that blunts some of the emotional impact, but it doesn't blunt it completely, to speak quite honestly. There are very few people in business who've had a company at which they either started or were part of the starting team and stay through it for the whole journey. Most people who have had interesting professional lives at the junction of science and business have been part of many companies. How many is too many? Changing jobs every 2 years is a really bad idea. It leads to a resume that is toxic. 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, even 15 years is a pretty good run.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, so, in some cases, you may not have a choice. Your company ceases operations. For me, the company was acquired. I've had that happen multiple times, and the company was acquired by a much larger company. And if you're on the management team of the smaller company, typically you're phased out over a period of time. However, I will say that, I wouldn't be where I was if I didn't have all the different experiences I've gathered throughout my career, right? Because I've got all the operations experience, because I've got the investment experience. I think early on in your career, you have to be more careful when you get to more senior management roles. If, for example, I was at Genome Therapeutics Corporation running a research team. I asked about a business development role in the company, and the VP of HR said, "You're a research guy. You don't know anything about business," right? So in that case, I could have just, suck it up, buttercup, or find a way to get the experience I needed to be qualified in that type of role. So I left the company and worked for a consulting group, consulting for the pharmaceutical industry. So, if you have this kind of idea or vision of where you want to get to eventually, you try and gain those skills and experiences that will get you to a point where you are a viable candidate. And you may learn over time that what you thought interests you is no longer the case. So in that case, it's also, worthwhile to explore new opportunities. So I'd say, the days of working at IBM for 35 years are gone, right? Pensions don't exist. And it is much more common these days to move from a different job, to new jobs every 2 to 3 to 4 years. Now, there's a risk of doing that, but I don't think it's quite frowned on as much as it used to be. It's just a much more fluid environment that we live in.
Okay, I want to combine a couple questions here along those lines as we're talking about, making those transitions. Advice that you would have for how do you break into some of these fields? What are things that folks can do? And then as you're trying to make some of those transitions, what's the importance in terms of publications versus other skill sets? So which really within an industry setting, how do you go about making some of those initial moves to break into one of the fields, whether it's venture or industry or anything along those lines? And then, what should you be focused on now in terms of trying to highlight publications you have or skill sets, things of that nature?
So I'll take an initial swing, and then Michael and Stan can maybe add to that. You say publications to me, and even if you bring that up in kind of your rubric, that tells me you want to do research, because candidly, in industry, the amount of publications in your H-index in industry, unless you're that principal scientist in the big ass company, doesn't matter. I'll be that provocative. What matters is how you come into my organization and how rapidly you know what the problems are and how rapidly you can solve them. Right. So, and then communicate that back out, because Michael said it earlier, I'm going to seize on that. The timelines in industry, even for that of pharmaceutical companies, are shorter than that of academia. So your ability to come in and make an impact and communicate that impact are what will differentiate you. And I don't care if that's you as a PhD doing basic science research. I don't care if that's you as a PhD doing market access work for the pharmaceutical company, or the PhD that's running part of a CRO with a clinical research organization within that institution. I think those are truisms there. To how do you break into at least kind of those three quick verticals I sketched out? It's networking, right? So, and you could do that network actively or passively, right? You could see what's out there in the world, or you can go and find what's out there in the world. And fortunately, in Colorado, you have somewhat of a vibrant a startup ecosystem that you can network in. I think as you expand out to more of the established companies in Colorado, it winnows pretty quickly. So we don't have a true vertical. We kind of have like a pyramid, a lot of startup, fewer super tankers in the space. So network, 6 degrees of separation is probably very true now in today's day and age, where Bruce knows somebody that can get you at least a warm introduction to somebody. You have Colorado Bioscience you could be a member of. The university itself is a great networker. Remember, Anschutz and Boulder operate differently. So if there's someone in Boulder you want to get to, leapfrog that way. So those would be, they work uniquely differently. That would be some of my advice across that continuum of questions.
Yeah, and I would add to that too. So if you're thinking about going into industry, cast a broad net. I mean, there's just not a lot in Colorado. And my wife's, her postdocs, graduate students have asked me these questions before. She's actually had postdocs, I think, that have done industrial postdocs at Genentech. So if you don't have a reason why you have to stay in Colorado, the odds of finding something will grow exponentially, especially if you're looking in the Bay Area, San Diego, and Boston, which tend to be, the life science hubs, especially startup hubs. If you want to go into big pharma, you're talking about New Jersey, Pennsylvania, so forth and so on. Even international experience would be pretty cool. But I think if you're thinking about going into the research side in industry, they're looking for certain techniques, certain expertise that dovetail with the research programs that they have underway. So that's really hard to find the perfect fit. I do think publications do help in that sense, but another thing to keep in mind too, again, towards the point on networking, is make sure you have a LinkedIn profile, right? I had some folks proactively reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn prior to this call, gold star for that. But also think about converting your CV into a resume, right? Which is not 20 pages, it's 2 pages, and condensing and making it as high impact as possible. When you're looking at an opportunity, customizing that resume to make sure that you're hitting what techniques they're looking for. They may say, I'm looking for, HPLC and immunohistochemistry and in situ hybridization, yada, yada, yada. If you've done that, make sure that you highlight those in your resume.
Can I rephrase the question for Stan? Because he's been in a different position, hiring a lot of PhDs and postdocs. So when you were hiring educated, skilled people, what were the things that you were looking for, Stan? Does it really actually matter? Sometimes as PhDs, we're maybe, I don't know what's the right word, but overemphasize our education. But when you start working in any industry, you'll have to actually relearn a lot of the things.
That's a great question. I think I often begin interviews by asking people, what they've done, and what that really, and I tried very quickly to get is, what do you think the impact of what you've done is? Now, frankly, a lot of work doesn't have impact by itself, but asking people to put their work in context tells you a lot about the way they think. So context is everything in science. For a young investigator, focusing too much on the papers is not valuable when you're hiring, because very often it's a reflection of the advisor's curiosity as much as it is of the young scientist's curiosity. I respond well to people who are curious, to people who explain clearly the problem, the solution, the challenges they encountered, and people who can answer questions well. As part of an interviewing process, certainly at my companies, I think pretty much at most companies, we ask young scientists to come and make presentations to the team. And the team are older and younger and curmudgeonly and grumpy and charming. And, so the exposure to that and how a person handles him or herself gives us a lot of insight into how he or she will work out. But I don't count, I think to the earlier question, I don't count papers. I care a lot about referrals from senior faculty, but there's just so many senior faculty one can know, so that is an imperfect system. I always perk up if people have patents, because patents are cousins to papers. They're not the same thing as papers, and in industry, very often a far more interesting cousin. The peer process of interviews, the one-on-one interviewing that takes place among members of the scientific team to figure out if personalities mesh as well as scientific contribution is likely to mesh, is very important as well. So group presentations, interviews with the boss, and interviews with peers are the elements that my companies we use to choose people.
Yeah, and I'd say that when you're interviewed, let's say you get that interview for, industry postdoc or a scientist position at a company, what they're looking for is how easy are you to work with? How adaptable are you, right? Do you do well with change? Are you the kind of person that's going to proactively take on responsibilities versus somebody having to ask you to do things? Are you going to anticipate what your supervisor wants rather than waiting for him or her to ask you to do things? Do you do well under pressure? Or do you go screaming off into the night because you just can't take it anymore? So those are also things to keep in mind. Practicing your interview skills, in person versus Zoom. Who knows how soon we'll start having in-person interviews, but you may be interviewed by 5 or 6 people at one time. How do you handle that? That's a bit of an art form, right? Doing well in the interview by committee type of setting.
The one thing I would add is, what is your story, right? And I mean that as to what is your story, or what is your brand, or what is your mission statement? Bruce, I was taking the opportunity to look through some of the questions, and I'll tell you what, in industry, there's no such thing as a right or wrong answer. And Michael even said it earlier, right? Things change, right? So whereas your PhD is all about getting to a right answer in a sense, right? So I would want you to think through that there are better and lesser answers in industry, right? There's a continuum of solutions, and we're trying an optimization problem for that moment in time. So what is your story, right? Why are you interested in industry? Is it, why did you get those 2 degrees? Is there a broader story? I cherry picked those, the one, hey, I have advanced degrees and I've been told I've overqualified. I think there's a story behind those 2 degrees. And if it's, hey, I'm getting all this advanced education because I was told that you work in something you don't know anything about and trying never to work, and so I'm trying to learn about everything, that's a bad story, right? But if it's like, hey, I was looking to understand this problem, and then the translation of the applicability to a whole organism to solve a unique problem in that animal, then you're starting to explain why you collected these degrees versus you're collecting degrees. But it all gets to how do you tell your story? And without being too paternalistic, I'm trying to get that to my high achieving daughter, who's a chemistry major at Emory, who's already published a paper. It's like, that's all well and good, but what is your story, Emma? What are you articulating when you want to go to med school that differentiates you from the 10,000 other people that want that same spot, right? So at someday it gets at how do you tell your own story?
Very good. Good answer.
Yeah. So thank you for that. I agree that was a good answer. I'm hoping a lot of this is kind of resonating with other things that we have kind of been saying through the other aspects of this program. There's one question in here that I had a question that I wanted to hear all of your perspectives on, and I think it rolls in a little bit to one of the other questions here, which was a question about, opportunities for lateral movement within biotech firms. How do you, what opportunities are there if you get hired in as a scientist to do some of those, if you get interested in business, what opportunities are there? But then broadly, I would be curious to know your perspectives on what are some of the major differences between positions at smaller firms versus larger firms. So if someone's trying to make a choice about what fits best with them and their own interests and passions and things of that nature, what are some of the pros and cons? What are some of the similarities and differences between something like a startup and Genentech?
Well, at small companies, you get to wear many hats, and you much more quickly find where you fit best. And this is broadly in, let's just take basic research, applied research, product development, product marketing, business, market access. There's a whole range of hats that people with a scientific background wear. You'll find it more quickly in a small company. You'll find the hat that fits you best in a small company.
I would build on Stan's answer. I agree with that. The big company, however, does give you process, procedure, and rubrics to solve those problems in those areas, right? And they're going to be more defined. So if I give you my own startup experience, I started my day really being a chief medical officer. Then I wound my day into being a regulatory associate. And then I'm now volunteering for an hour, right? So that's been my startup day. And that would never have been my big company kind of a day, right? Because, here I was worried about what the P&L was for a monitoring modality in Europe, right? So that's a different set of concerns. It gets at, it kind of gets at how good are you at doing your job. And I don't mean it to be that pedantic, but if you can solve problems and solve them well, and you have a good champion boss, right? Because I've seen that, and that's a big corporate America answer. So let me peel that back a little bit. I've seen people's careers accelerate because they've had a good boss, and I've seen people's careers absolutely come to a screeching halt because they've had a bad boss. And so there is a combination of how well you do, but how well of a champion you've been fortunate enough to surround yourself with to launch you into either that lateral position, the vertical position, or the diagonal position. That doesn't happen kind of in the small company because there's 4 of you, right? But in the big company, that context, as to use Stan's phrase from earlier, solid science does matter.
Yeah, and that's hugely important. I can't emphasize that enough, is find somebody you want to work for, right? And hopefully in those first few interviews, you get a sense of, are they a mentor, right? Are they going to work with you to help you grow, right? And get to a point where you can take their job at some point in time. You don't want to work for, I'm not going to use foul language here, but somebody who's just toxic, right? So try and have your antenna up when you're having a conversation with the person who's going to be your supervisor, and really try and understand them, what makes them tick. Do you guys click? Is it going to be a good relationship, or is it going to be hell from day one? And I've had those situations where I loved my job. I loved what I was doing. My company was acquired by another company, a much bigger company. From a financial perspective, it was great, but then they sucked us in, and I was reporting to somebody who I didn't have. That wasn't my choice to work for them, and they made life a living hell. And you don't want to be in that kind of situation. So back to the question about small versus larger company, it's about resources too, right? So if you're working at a well-funded small company, that's great. You've got 2 to 3 years worth of runway as far as how much funding you have, or you're living month to month trying to raise additional funding. That's very stressful. Working for a larger company, you have more resources, but you are, in a very matrixed organization, and you may, have less visibility across the organization, and your role is the same every single day. Now, if you're okay with that, and some people are, fantastic. But if you want the ability to grow in an organization, a small organization might make more sense. If it's a good, bigger company, that's also great. And some people shine in larger companies, and they get promoted and they've got responsibility, they've got international responsibility, right? So they're working with teams in Asia and Europe. That could be cool as well. So there's no easy answer to that question, at least not in my mind.
Okay, so then I'll follow up to that one, which is to kind of get your perspectives and advice for people as they're trying to navigate career transitions and make some of these decisions. So there's a question in here about if you don't have industry experience, but positions say they want industry experience, how do you get that? The idea of, what is the right environment for that? What advice do you have for trainees for how they can start finding answers to those questions based on your own experiences or other observations?
So Bruce, I'll fall on that grenade. First of all, let me give you the big company perspective. There's a thing called a boilerplate job description that you have to fight God, mother, and country to kind of change the elements of, because it's controlled 3 levels up in Minneapolis or was controlled in Boston. All that to say, if there's a job you think you're qualified for, don't let the job rec turn you away from it. The worst thing you do is you get discounted, which, by the way, if you don't apply, you're discounted anyway, right? So there's no harm there. And that's the advice I give my graduate student son, right? He's like, but dad, they're looking for 2 years of experience. I'm like, dude, it's really what have you done? If you can show them that you could do this big data analytics that solves their problem, and that's his space, they're not going to care that you don't have the requisite 2.5 years of experience. If you can solve the problems they think this role needs to solve, right? That's just true. And then, understand that, right? I'll liken it to my angel experience a little bit, which is when an angel investor comes in, just tell the angel story. You should be doing your homework on the angel organization you're pitching just as much as they're doing their homework on you from an investment perspective. When you apply for that job, do as much homework on the company as you can, know what they care about. And today's day and age, because of LinkedIn, you can actually do homework on the hiring manager, which when Michael and I and Clay Stan, when we were starting, you couldn't do that at all, right? Unless you happen to know the person, you couldn't do that. But with LinkedIn, you can kind of get a sense of, okay, well, Dave went to Hopkins and he did all this. You can start formulating a stereotype, whether it's right or wrong, but then see who Dave's connected to and start understanding the person you could be working for, right? So there's ways today to do homework in unprecedented fashions versus when I was trying to get that first job, and never lose sight of the market cycles. And I'm going to tell, for A, I'll age myself, and B, I'll tell you my story. My undergraduate degree was 89, and you couldn't help but throw a stone and get it wet, right? There were jobs galore. The economy was fantastic. I made the wrong decision of going to graduate school, because I'll tell you why. Because in 93, when I left, the market sucked. Right. And so there is something to be timing when you're looking for that first job, which is, kind of a little bit of where we are today. So that's my 2 cents, more than 2 cents.
Yeah. And the other thing too is one of my previous companies was called VirusSite. And, it was a 15-person company. It was acquired by Sartorius in 2016. We had an R&D, a small R&D group of about five people. And we were more than happy to interview folks for a research scientist position who had just completed their PhD or had done a postdoc, but they had to have really the specific experiences that we were looking for. So in that case, had they used flow cytometry? Did they have experience with viruses? Did they have experience with antibody labeling, antibody manufacturing, developing reagents, things like that? And so if they had those initially, we used LinkedIn for our to post the job. We'd have a phone call initially just to make sure, they could have a coherent conversation with us, and they sounded like somebody who's going to be, good to work with. Bring them in for interviews, and it clicks sometimes. So they're confident, they're really excited about what you're doing. They've done their homework. They're asking questions about your company, right? They're not just sort of there responding to questions. They're proactively asking questions, or how do you do this? I saw this is one of your approaches or techniques. Can you tell me more about that? Because it wasn't clear. Or, I see that you did your PhD and blah, blah, blah. Tell me more about that. Or we have a shared connection. Just little things like that add up to being a more viable candidate for those types of positions. So I don't think it's a deal breaker that you don't already have industry experience to get that industry job. It's just finding the needle in the haystack, finding the right fit.
Okay. So I think we have one more question here. And then so I would, again, Cheatham, if there's any final question you want, I want to make sure you have a chance to ask that too. This one, I think, general comments on the question is about soft skills that you learn in an academic environment that translate to skills important in industry. I like referring to these as professional skills, though. I don't like the soft skills term. So what are those non-technical skills that people would be learning or should be learning that are going to become important for success working outside of academia?
So putting aside for a moment, let me just turn off this. Putting aside for a moment, not being a jerk and things like that, being an engaging person. I think the most important skill is effective communications. Learn how to write a good 1 or 2 page memo. Learn how to do a slide presentation. If some of you have kept bad habits, I'll be blunt here. If some of you have kept bad habits of saying and like, leave that behind. Men and women, a few words, are men and women who succeed.
I would add to Stan's, so I'm just going to apple polish Stan's apple. Just keep in mind that a great presentation in academia is not a great presentation in the business world. And I just lived that. I could choke my PI's site initiation presentation because it was like every bad Congress presentation I ever sat in front of. It wasn't the way to train the nurses on our therapy, right? So so the blue slides with the yellow font, I would kill you in industry. So the bar gets changed with those quote unquote soft skills, or really what I would say is make sure your EQ is better than your IQ when you move into industry.
And I would add to that, don't eat other people's food in the refrigerator. That's an important soft skill. But hopefully you learned. Things like being able to ask questions or to challenge without being a jerk, right? So to disagree without being disagreeable, right? So you're having your lab meeting, you still have those in industry, your team meeting, having a polished presentation. Here's what I've done this week. I need your feedback. Here are some challenges I'm having. Asking for help is equally important. Making it understandable for non-technical people. So, a small company, you might giving a weekly or monthly update, and the CEO of the company is there, but she may not have the technical depth that you do. But not dumbing it down, but making it easy for anybody to understand and appreciate what you're doing is also important.
Cheatham, is there any final question for you? Otherwise, we can just have some final comments, but go ahead.
Not a question, but I want to emphasize what Michael has been saying, because I'm a social scientist living in this different scientific world, right? So being able to explain what you're doing to other folks that are not coming from the same background as yours is actually very important, especially if you're trying to move to industry, because people that are going to be hiring you are not going to be as interested in your deeper, scientific conversations, but you have to be able to explain what you have done in a potentially lay language. So I would definitely practice on that communication skills.
So I really appreciate that comment too, and just kind of where this conversation went. We frequently talk about science communication like presenting to the lay public for things, but I think oftentimes people forget how insulated and isolated they are when they're constantly talking to their peer scientists in their peer lab meetings in their department or at their professional societies about not just what people understand, but what people care about. And the reality that what you're studying is so important is known to you and your peers, but other people they think other diseases are more important. And so how do you present that in a way that invites people into that conversation? I think is one of those skills. It's interesting for me to think about that as being a specific thing for kind of preparing for industry positions, applying, talking to folks like that, because I see that as one of those general areas that we're often deficient in our training for science communication.
And you guys are living through a perfect example, right? Which is how do you explain the science of virus epidemiology, what's going on with the pandemic? That's every day in industry. So if you're talking at this PhD researcher level and not getting it translated and understanding what their risk is, you're seeing a great example of it right now.
I realize we have only 1 minute, but now I have a question and I don't know if you have time, but if you were like to have the chance to go back like in time, what would you have done differently? Like basically, how can we learn from your mistakes? For this audience, I think it might be an important thing. Was it a tough question?
I'll
That's okay.
I'll bite. I might have gotten my MBA earlier in my career. I don't have an MBA. I've got, a life MBA, but, at some point earlier on in my 30s, it might have made sense to do it. I do wish I had more international experience, where I had a chance to work for larger companies, and I have. Sartorius is one of those, but, I really appreciated some of the things that allows you to do working for a larger company. It's got global exposure and the resources that you can tap into in something like that. But I have no regrets. It's not always been easy. Sometimes it's been very challenging. It's been a bumpy road. And there was a question about, that it sounds like it's, I forgot what the word was that was used, but it can be kind of stressful. Yeah, it can be. And if you're not okay with some amount of uncertainty and kind of a twisting ride throughout your career path, then this might not be the right place for you.
For hard cheese, what would I do differently? That's, I swing like a pendulum on nothing and then everything, kind of depending on what day you catch me on. I think the engineer in me comes out, though, if I actually take a moment of reflection, which is life is a constrained problem. Right. And how do you solve that? I mean, I agree with Michael. It would have been nice to have been able to take an overseas assignment. My wife was a physician, so that's not possible. So you're always balancing so here's my advice. When you have very few encumbrances, be as selfish as you can, because you'll get to a point where you have a multimodal equation you're solving, and it's a system of equations, and you've got to optimize it versus maximize it. So maximize it personally when you can, and then optimize it when you can't. That's how I'd go back and think of a rubric. How's that for a nerdy engineering answer?
Stan, we give the last word to you, I guess.
Yeah, I would have spent a lot of time on interviewing. So I'm the guy who goes from 0 people to a company of 100, 120 people. So I interview everyone. I never stop interviewing every person who joins the company. I would have spent even more the quality of the outcome. Quality of the market is the ultimate determinant of the outcome, but how easily or how not so easily you get there is determined by the quality of the people that you hire. So I would have spent even more time focused on hiring and firing.
Well, that was wonderful. I learned a lot today. I'm sure that our participants did as well. I want to thank you all for giving us some of your time today to talk about your experiences and perspectives. And I think with that, again, I hope we can apply some of this information. Maybe you'll be getting some LinkedIn requests, things of that nature going forward. But otherwise, that's kind of all I have to say. Again, a big thank you for giving some of your time today. This was great. Cheatham, any closing comments you want to make too?
No, I want to thank all the panelists. I think this was, I wish I had this much of input when I was starting my career. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And to all of our panelists, if there's ever anything we can do to pay you back, just let me know. Happy to refer people your way if needed. So
sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.